Since I've started my channel, I've really only focused on two properties. Disney's Wish, which not only has some terrible songs, but probably the most horrible songs in Disney's entire catalog, and then also Has Been Hotel. And Has Been Hotel has been much more favorable. They are nowhere near as terrible as Wish, but during all this, there has been a lot of criticism, there has been rewrites, and it's prompted you guys to ask me, Cal, what is a perfect song? And obviously, the idea of a perfect song is subjective, but I understand what you guys are asking. We've talked about what doesn't work in music, and then I've shown corrections to show how it could work better, or how I think that it could function better to achieve what the songwriters wanted to do. But how do we talk about a song that is amazing, that has none of those notes? How do we talk about how well something works, as opposed to why something doesn't? And what better way to do that than talk about one of the greatest villain songs of all time? And okay, I know that that may be going too far when Friends on the Other Side, or Hellfire, or Poor Unfortunate Souls exist, but How Can I Refuse is an iconic banger, and I can't believe that I'm seeing this right. No one else on this entire website has ever analyzed this song. Like, I just can't believe it. The void is waiting there. So how can I refuse? Good day, everybody. It is Calxiyn here to nerd out on Calxiyn Cares Too Much about something that maybe only I care about. But I'm gonna make you care about this because this is important. This may be the most important video I ever make of my entire life because we need to recognize how amazing How Can I Refuse is. Thank you to all my patrons and YouTube membership members for making this possible. If you want to support me, get early access, you should definitely check that out. But if you just want to send some support my way, you can check out YouTube Super Thanks. And without further ado, let's just get into it. So Barbie Princess and the Pauper as a whole is a lot deeper than you guys may think. Hopefully by now you guys have seen my in-depth analysis on the entire movie, but these videos are just going to focus on the individual songs. So we're going to be talking about instrumentation, rhythm, lyrics, and Preminger's characterization phrase by phrase. So let's talk about the instrumentation first without the lyrics. The song opens with a very ominous instrumentation, and while Preminger is singing, there's this skittering noise around as if he's literally a cockroach. Something else that is super wild to me about the instrumentation is that it sounds like how you'd imagine an old school mining operation or a factory of some kind. There's a ch-ch sound, and Hadestown actually uses something similar. So not only does it emphasize that Preminger is a villain, but the harsh mining sound effect, the thing that sounds like machinery in there, lets us know that this has been a meticulous operation by Preminger. And it also helps to drive home the fact that he is a peasant. Annalise has instruments that are associated with royalty, but this sounds mechanical and rough. And this doesn't just serve as a contrast to other characters, but even a contrast to Preminger himself, because we start out this way, but then royal instruments are added as he continues to sing. After dues, there's another creepy sound, but after saying the last gold has been dug, there's a happier chime. This sort of reactive music is very important for musical theater, and it's something that Wish's villain songs didn't have. Now we have an example of these positive and negative reactions in the music that are directly caused by Preminger's words. So we open with some very nice descriptive language, which immediately tells us a lot about Preminger in just a few lines. Scraping and escaping have a very nice rhyme with each other because, as I mentioned in my other videos, it's not enough to rhyme ing. You need the middle of the word to help it rhyme, and so you can't rhyme working and singing just because they both end that way. You can rhyme singing and ringing because they both have the same middle section. And so scraping and escaping is very nice, and it also feels connected. He's been scraping to do what? To escape. Been bowing is really strong for this opening because we have the double B's, and then we have the same thing for lying like. We have nice alliteration for these words. And instead of the repetition feeling lazy, the repetition emphasizes how hard it's been for him. It's similar to All My Life from Hunchback. It's not just there because the writer couldn't think of anything, but rather, I've been doing this, and even worse, I've been doing this, and finally, the worst of all, I've been doing this. And of course, we have some nice consistent syllable counts here. When it comes to the meaning of these lyrics, instead of just the technical elements, bowing reflects his obedience, and scraping implies that clawing his way to the top. It could also be like when people are saying scraping pennies together, but not necessarily about money, just in terms of resourcefulness, taking whatever he could to pull off this plan. It's not just scraping like the physical action of claws, but just the difficulty to collect something, enough power, enough trust, enough social influence to become the queen's advisor. And something really important about the song is it has enough specific language to paint a very clear picture, but at the same time, it is open to interpretation on some points. And this is one of the ones that makes me so excited. Okay, so lying has 3 distinct meanings and I just find that mind-blowing because again, this is a direct-to-DVD animated Barbie movie. Like, Barbie just never got the recognition in comparison to Disney, but somebody considered this so carefully. Lying like a rug means lying as in being walked all over, like being stepped on, okay? So that's a first thing, walked all over. The second thing is lying as in lying to the queen the entire time, so an actual lie, like Pinocchio. And then we have lying in wait, which means waiting for an opportunity to strike. And so that's so insane, like forced to the ground as in I have been stepped on, lying physically down to be stealthy, and then verbally lying, like who cooked? Somebody cooked here, guys. In 10 long years is a great way to convey to the audience that for Preminger, this has been grueling, because they could have used any word here. Really, they could have even just said 10 years and used a different word somewhere else. But the way that he says long is really important because it expresses his dissatisfaction with the fact that it's taken so long, but also his tenacity. He's been at this for 10 years. Think about that. Think about working towards one goal. That's like half my lifetime. For Preminger, it's probably less than that, but think about that if you're around my age. He's been working for half of your lifetime to do this thing. And even words that you may not think about, like had, tell us so much because it implies that he was forced. He didn't want to pay his dues. He didn't happen to pay his dues. He had to do it. There was no other way to get here than letting himself get stepped on for as long as he did. And so even in words that you may not think, if you're writing your own song, you may not think that this is important. This is actually very important to deliver information to the audience in a very short lyric. Okay, so pay my dues. I'm laughing because I'm so excited, but pay my dues is also a very loaded phrase here. It means that you earned or are entitled to something because you worked or made sacrifices. So you may have heard this, for example, when people are about to retire, right? They may say they worked 25 years, they paid their dues. It means fulfilling my obligation. But it's not only if you earned something through hard work, it can also mean if you earned something because you suffered for it. I worked for this long, I went through hell, I earned it. Here's another reason why pay my dues is important, and you're gonna have to walk with me, okay? Because later in the song, this may seem like a tangent, it's not. Later in the song, we find out that Preminger is a peasant's son, and so he is presumably, or was, a peasant before becoming the queen's advisor. So the context of this entire thing is that Preminger was a peasant who for 10 long years has been clawing his way to power, clawing his way to the top. And this movie as a whole has a lot of themes surrounding power, materialism, and greed. And then Julian and Erica, as the other peasants, are supposed to contrast or foil Preminger. We don't know how long Julian has been a servant for Annalise, but Preminger goes out of his way to belittle and condescend Julian multiple times throughout the movie. And I think that the reason why he hates Julian so much is for 2 reasons. He was able to win Annalise's affection without trying. From Preminger's perspective, Julian did not pay his dues, did not earn it. Preminger has been plotting this for years. Julian has not. But the other thing is that Julian is willing to stand aside. I think that Preminger thinks that Julian is weak because he's willing to hide his feelings for Annalise and let her marry King Dominic without a word. So I think in Preminger's mind, Julian has this opportunity to execute this cunning plan, and then he doesn't. The reason why I'm explaining this right now is because it's important to start thinking about that, to start thinking how Julian speaks of Annalise, how Erica sings about freedom as a peasant in comparison to how Preminger sings about it, and also how Preminger sees other peasants as well. These lyrics put Erica and Preminger in direct contrast to each other because both of them want to escape. Both of them want to be free. However, the way that Erica has been doing that is by trying to make money on the side. She tries to sing on the street to get some extra money to pay off Madame Carp. Whereas Preminger is stealing from the queen to do it. And so with Pay My Dues and the rest of his explanation here, his mentality is really clear to us. He is a peasant who is saying, fuck fuck you got mine to all the rest of the peasants. He is stealing all the kingdom's gold that would stop the peasants from starving so he can elevate his own social standing. Instead of wanting to make things better for all the people in the social class that he used to be a part of, he wants to rise to the top of the system. He doesn't want to actually change it. Even though Madame Carp treats Erica badly, she never says anything similar to this in her lines. Like, she talks about in Free that she could run away, and she could run away from her debt, but that wouldn't be right. Whereas Preminger, he doesn't care. He'll steal as long as it means he'll get out, and that shows the difference in their moral character. How can he refuse something as tempting as gold sitting out in plain view? No one else is cunning enough to do it. He worked hard. He deserves it. Back to the rhyming and the rhythms though for a minute. Pay and today are nice internal rhymes because it doesn't feel very forced. It feels natural. You may not have even noticed. I also like rug and dug, and so some people may think for the last gold has been dug is sort of awkward, and I think it would be awkward coming from another character, but not Preminger. I think it works for him. He's trying to be pretentious. It's like, for the prophecy has come to fruition, but for his own story, right? And so I don't find the for the last gold has been dug super awkward or anything. I think it makes sense to me based on how he speaks. It's good characterization for him. Because you'll notice as we go through this song that Preminger sort of thinks of himself as a fairy tale character almost. So I think that this works. It's like he's the hero, he's the protagonist of his own story, and that's super important for when you're writing a villain character. The best advice I ever got when it came to villains was that villains do not think that they are villains. Villains think that they are the protagonists. And there was also a great explanation. I can't remember now, I'm going on a tangent. Now this is off script, but there was a performer that used to work for Disney and she was friends with Lady Tremaine, and her rationale was Lady Tremaine just wants the best for her daughters. She doesn't see what she's doing as wrong. Like, it's a hard world out here. She's a widow. She's a woman, a widowed woman with 2 female daughters, no son for an heir. Like, she's just doing what a girl has to do, what a woman has to do, right? And so with that, when you write a villain, that's the way that you have to think, that the villain thinks that their behavior is justified, or at least they have to have protagonist mindset. There's not a technical term for this, but I just like long and waiting. It's not even in contrast to each other. I'm not entirely sure what to call it, but it's just this idea of he's been at this for so long, and then the gold, like personified, was just waiting there for him. After all these years of hard work, the gold was just waiting there this entire time for him to be the hero. So how could he refuse? And I do like how had and how, they're in very nice similar positions here. We got how can I refuse? Had to pay my dues. It tickles the ear very nicely. Like, this entire thing just tickles the ear nicely, but that's why. And how can I refuse in of itself has 4 different functions to me, and maybe you guys can find more. I challenge you, find another one that's not one of the ones that I said, but I think I figured out as much as I could. So we have false politeness, right? Like, you know when you go to somebody's house and they offer you food, you're kind of supposed to say no a couple times before you say yes, and then you're like, oh, well, if you insist, how can I say no? So that's the first one, the false politeness. How can I refuse is how can I say no to this when you're being so polite? The gold itself was insisting to be taken. But the second meaning is to show the depths of his greed. Like, he literally cannot help himself. This is just my interpretation, but the third one is a reference to an offer you can't refuse. So like, there's a more positive meaning, like something is so attractive and so tempting because it has no downsides, like who could possibly say no? But 4, there's also a more threatening meaning to that. Like, you know, in the mob, it's like, I'm gonna make you an offer you can't refuse, right? Like, you feel compelled to take the offer because otherwise there will be negative consequences for you if you don't. So I think that Preminger is using all of these meanings, sometimes at the same time, but just in general throughout the entire song. So it's important to remember that. Just to explain that again a bit more succinctly, we have 1, I couldn't possibly take the gold, but like, if you insist, because you're being so polite offering it to me, how can I say no? I literally can't resist taking the gold because it's an uncontrollable impulse. Like when we talk about stuff like the deadly sins, right? Like greed and lust, it's like overpowering. I can't control myself or my actions. It's just so tempting. I'm falling into temptation. Then we have, I can't possibly refuse taking the gold because there's no downside. The queen's not gonna know. We can't possibly fail. And then 4, if I don't do this, I will never be free, which is the consequence. That's the offer you can't refuse, because otherwise something bad will happen to you. You are threatened. Even if it's not really a threat as in like somebody's, coming after you or something, it's the threat that he will never be free. That's why he can't refuse. In my previous videos, I've talked about this idea of structure, of keeping the same syllable count if you're reusing the same melody, and then also keeping the same rhyme structure. And so when you look at this, you may actually think that it's a mistake based on things I previously said. However, it's not a mistake. This is the intro, and then these verses are their own separate entity. So if we look at the entire song, what we actually have is an intro, and then after that, the first verse, the chorus, another verse, the bridge, a modification of the original intro, then a verse, and the outro. And so that's why these are actually different here. We've talked about the importance of making things match, but the verses match each other. The song does a great job at making things feel familiar, but then also changing them a little, because that's something I've talked about as well. You want your audience to kind of get locked in, or to snap into the song, I always call it. And so you want to do something that is familiar, and then have the audience be lulled into that false sense of security before you change it. And so with these two verses being the same, we still have a very familiar sound and familiar pattern, but it's slightly adjusted in a way that's not jarring, but it's also a little bit different. So we have a little bit of spice, if you want to call it that. So when we get into the instrumental of the second verse, we have the heroic trumpets and drums, especially with returning home a hero, but the mechanical sound is still in the background. And so that creates a nice little soundscape for us. We have the mechanical sound that we talked about, the ch-ch before, but we also have the skittering noise that is still present. So we see the peasant life, the machinery, and then we have the royal life, the heroic life. And How Can I Refuse this time even has a bit more of a trumpet on it. I really like home a hero. That's some really nice alliteration, and then also husband, health, and how, like, just the consistency of all those H words in this entire verse has some nice flow. It's also interesting because, for better or for worse, Preminger considers the kingdom his home, which may be very surprising, but that's a bit more of a sentimental side to his villainy. Again, a lot of information in just a couple words. Now, mighty wealth is a very interesting word choice because in terms of the audience, you guys may be thinking mighty is usually associated with a warrior. You're a mighty warrior. Not really mighty wealth. You have mighty strength or something like that, but not usually wealth. But I think that this is actually very telling because, again, in just 2 lyrics, what do we learn? Preminger associates wealth with strength. Instead of physical strength, he prioritizes wealth as might. And again, in terms of some diction things, better, bring, back, like those are all very nice. And Suitor Who Will Suit Her is objectively a banger. Like, just what a banger of a line. Like, that's so smart and so clever. Like, it just gets me excited every time because I'm like, oh my god, like, how did they even think about that? But what I find interesting about this is that it's very professional. Like, it's not at all romantic, and I think that's so telling for Preminger's characterization. It sounds like a matchmaker, right? Like, these two people are well suited for each other. They'll make a nice political match. He'll be suitable, she'll be suitable, right? And so he'll be suitable, which will suit her needs, which is to revive the kingdom. There's no romance. It's just like, I will suit her just fine. And I think that that's just really funny on Preminger's part because this is just another business deal. It's so telling for his character. And choose and refuse is especially nice, not just because it rhymes, but it does so. Let's go. Oh my goodness, something actually rhymes in a song I'm talking about for once. But it's also because we're playing with this idea of choice. Like, we talked about those 4 meanings of how could I refuse before, but in this case, choose is really important here because Annalise doesn't really have a choice, and that's the whole point, that it won't really be a choice for her at all. What better husband could a princess choose means that there's nobody else in the running. So it actually won't be a choice. He's pretending as though she has a choice, but really she won't because he has eliminated any competition. And health is very nice because these words are especially connected. The kingdom is dying, and the only way to restore it is wealth. So the only way to bring the kingdom back to health is through Preminger's wealth, and that's just so smart. But yeah, it pushes this idea that Annalise cannot do any better than Preminger and won't have another option because his wealth is the only thing that is in between the kingdom, living or dying. And I really like this bottom line right here, and I'll wear the crown for how can I refuse. It's like, well, I only wanted to help the kingdom, but I suppose marrying the princess would make me a prince. Like, if that's what you insist my reward should be, how could I refuse? Like, it's all false modesty. I guess I'll wear the crown. I mean, if you insist. And for this next little bit here, in terms of the instruments, we have gone like full-blown royalty music, the trumpets, the fanfare. And this nicely contrasts the mechanical sound that we heard earlier. So like, this is Preminger's reality now. Again, Hadestown, we are in the mines, right? We are trapped in literal hell, Hadestown kind of sound, right? And then now it's like fanfare, the dream. And so we have the dream versus the reality, and they do that so nicely. I try to stay away from slang so I don't age my own videos, but I really can't resist to say that this ate and left no crumbs, as they say. Because we have raise, and then we have rouse, and then we have rain. Like, that alliteration is just so good. And then praise and Preminger as alliteration is so good. Cheer and charge, like there's so many nice little brain tingly things that are happening. This rhyme is very clean here, and raise every glass is of course a reference to toasting or cheers. And so I think saying that like rouse every cheer is actually quite clever, because rouse could mean like cause to feel excited, like the crowds were roused by a speech, for example. But you can also say things like rouse out of or rouse out of sleep. So maybe I'm reading too much into things, as we do, because I care too much. But I wonder if this is also about the people, like they're tired, they feel hopeless. We see this in the movie. So it's not rouse as in we're rousing their cheers, we're making them excited, but also maybe rousing them out of the nightmare, like snapping them out of this monotonous daze. They won't feel hopeless anymore. It could also be implying that the people didn't know how amazing he was either. Like, I know sleeping on him is kind of a modern phrase, but I wonder if the idea is opening the people's eyes to how amazing he is, how amazing he always was. Like, the people didn't know that this entire time I've been the one making the decisions. The queen doesn't know anything. Now they'll see me for the hero that I actually am, and the hero I was the whole time. Because what follows this is praise that the reign of Preminger is here. That's what I love about this section. It's the people can celebrate because Preminger is here. Preminger is going to rescue them. He is going to give them hope. And master in charge, that's interesting, right? Because it's not even about being a king or a prince, is it? Because they could have said ruler in charge, and then we would have had raise, rouse, reign, and ruler. Like, ruler in charge of all that I see. It wouldn't be that weird. But I think that master is better, and do you guys know why? It's because it's not about being the king, it's about wanting control. Master is the better word because it tells us this really isn't about being king, it's the power that being king will give him. He wants to actually be in charge without the queen getting in the way. So it's not just about being the king for the lavish lifestyle and the money and everything, it's that he will be the master of her as well. He will be the highest authority over everyone. So now we're at the second verse. And again, this matches, so very good consistent structure and the syllable count and the rhymes and all that sort of thing. And for the instrumental in this section, we have more royal trumpet coming in for a couple more reactions. And there's also this weird romantic violin around Coldly and the inner fire section. I don't think there's necessarily as much alliteration as there was in the first verse, but marrying and moat still has something nice to it, because again, these ideas are connected. Like, through marriage, he'll get the things, you know? And then desire and fire, that's a nice rhyme. Views and refuse, also nice rhyme. Inside and sign aren't rhymes or anything, but for some reason, there's just some bite to it. Like, sign of inner fire, for inside, she's thinking. Like, there's just something about it. I think it's because, like, there's the for fire, and then there's the I, like, for inside and then inner. But then there's also just something about the words being around each other. Like, it's almost like for inside and then sign of inner fire. Like, they're all taking little pieces from each other. So no technical word for that. It just has a nice bite to it. So, like, for the free people I've ever seen talk about the songs in this movie, even briefly, as I said, there's no YouTube analysis of this specific song yet, but people have talked about, like, is this lazy? Did the lyricists run out of ideas when they wrote this thing about the moat and the coat? Because, like, yeah, that's an internal rhyme, but, you know, I actually will defend this. I don't think it's lazy at all. I think that it's actually purposefully shallow. I don't think it's that the lyricist was running out of ideas, but Preminger is supposed to represent this materialism and this greed, where the hero characters go against this idea. There's more to living than gloves and gowns and threads and seams, right? Erica wants to travel around the world and sing. So contrast that, what Erica wants, to what Preminger wants. Superficial, pointless things. In this, we have a moat to separate him from the peasants, this ermine coat, which is the fur of European royalty, and then we also have palace views. He's literally going to look down at the peasants from his view at the palace. So if we're talking about this is the thanks I get with I let you live here for free and I don't even charge you rent, like, that's not a shallow line because the king is stupid. It's a stupid line because the lyricists didn't know what they were saying, right? And so in contrast, this is actually shallow for the purpose to be shallow, because Preminger is a superficial character. He did all this scheming not for his own pride, not to prove a peasant is smarter than a royal, let's say, but, like, it's for the luxuries. It's just for these superficial things. It's not to make actual change or anything either. Like, it's nothing that radical. It's just for this stuff. And what's interesting about this is that you may think that suddenly he's talking about Annalise. Like, how is that related? It's related because she is another object to him. Annalise is being treated like an object as well among all these other possessions, which is what makes this particular verse so smart. He's talking about a person as another thing that he wants. She is part of the list here. And immediately, we understand that he does not perceive Annalise with any agency. Even though she treats me coldly, I'm ignoring that. I know what she wants better than she does. She's just playing hard to get. And again, there's also a darker double meaning here, because on one hand, we have Preminger is so attractive, there's no downside. I will marry him, right? And she bats her eyelashes in this fantasy. Like, she'll fall for him just because of the money. Maybe Preminger genuinely thinks that money is a way to earn people's love and respect. But I also think, as a double meaning, like, deep down, he's just saying that. I don't think he actually believes that, though. Like, that's his fantasy. That's his imagination. What he knows in reality is that she is going to be forced to marry him, so she cannot refuse to love him. It's that the consequences of rejecting him after saving the kingdom are just too great. She can't refuse. This may be a bit too dark for a Barbie movie, but we have to remember, in this weird sort of, like, historical, like, pseudo-historical fictional time period, like, women could not refuse marital relations with their husband, right? And so we have to consider that also as the context in here. Like, they'll be married, so she can't refuse any romance, let's just call it, so this video doesn't get demonetized, right? So I didn't write down the talking sequence, but in terms of the instrumental, there is some interesting stuff going on here. When Nick and Knack are explaining what they've heard recently about the king, there's this like hesitant music of, like, I don't know if I should tell him about this thing. Here are the war trumpets, which sounds like here comes the bride. And then when Dominic is mentioned, we get these trumpets, but these trumpets feel different than the other trumpets that we've heard before. The other trumpets sound like, we welcome the king, but these trumpets sound like a declaration of war. And then we have that steppy sound because Nick and Knack aren't sure what to say. Like, they don't want to make Preminger angry. They are nervous, and then we see Preminger working up to explode in this section. They are nervous, and so that's the reactive music to their emotions, whereas Preminger working up to explode is the reactive music for his emotions. As we get into the bridge, we have to remember that Preminger didn't know about Dominic. This entire time, he's been singing like there's no alternative option for Annalise to marry. So this change, literally, we're pulling out the rug from under him right here. This song started as this was my evil plan, and now it's paying off, and now we have this big change where actually there are stakes again. It's not guaranteed that Preminger's plan is going to work. Like, the brass is brassing, the instrumentals are actually stopping underneath him. Like, he says something, and then they stop, right? He's so angry that the music is stopping. The instruments are too afraid to play without his express permission here.
And you always go, Silencio!
hand, you could interpret this as the music is too afraid to play, which I love that. But as a character, the music stops because he doesn't know what he's gonna say next. The entire time, the music has gone uninterrupted because he's had this speech prepared, this plan. But when music stops like this, it's because the character is either like so emotional or taking an intentional dramatic pause. But in this case, it's like he doesn't know what he's gonna say. And so the music stops because he has no plan. Like he's just talking in the moment here. And so it only comes back when he actually, this is probably something that he said before, this peasant's son won't turn and run. Like that's when it gets more consistent again, because these are things that he's probably said a million times before, even in his own head. And then we have this musical theater light bulb moment with this ah sound, right? When a character gets an idea, there's a ding. But you'll notice is that musically, this ding sounds twisted. Like instead of this pure note, if you want to call it that, it has this like wobble effect where it's like you can tell that it's like an evil idea. It's not a good idea. It's not like in Popular when Glinda starts with that ding because she's like, oh, I know what to do. I'm gonna make Elphaba pretty. Like it's not a pure of heart ding. It's like a boing. And I just love that so much.
That's what makes me so nice.
Silencio, No, Go, and Bo are just chef's kiss. Bo is really nice here, and it's not just for the rhyme either, because Bo implies youthfulness. It means a rich, fashionable young man. And so Preminger is condescending Dominic, like, oh, this young rich guy is gonna come in here, but he's not smart like I am. He doesn't have the years of experience that I do. It's almost like he's saying some kid is not gonna ruin my plans. And in terms of that alliteration, silencio, son, some, those are all really good. Reckless, royal, run. Everything in this phrase is just great. It's so well constructed. And lyrically, this is where we find out Preminger's backstory and the crux of his motivation. And so we only find out his motivation for doing all this when it is at stake, when he could be back to what he was before. And that's how this song builds such good stakes, because now we find out, this is the important part, if Preminger doesn't succeed, what's gonna happen to him? Because if Annalise marries King Dominic will probably, like, I don't know, in terms of like hierarchy and stuff, sometimes like it's like, oh, the queen stays queen until she dies. But in some other countries and places like throughout history, again, pseudo-historical, it's like, oh, well, the queen's only the queen because her husband died. As soon as there's a man, the man is at the top of the hierarchy. And what happens to Preminger? Dominic probably has his own advisors. So it's not even just the idea that his plan is falling apart, it's that he will be cast back down into the peasant system if he doesn't succeed. So the stakes are much higher. It's not like, oh, well, I just won't get that coat I want if I don't marry Annalise, but I'm still an advisor to the queen, so I'm still at a high social status. It's if I don't do this, I'm gonna be out of a job, and then I'll be as bad as the peasants are. And so he's been a peasant who has been trying to climb his way to the top of this social hierarchy for 10 years. Now is not the time to quit, just because Annalise, who again, he's talking about like she's a silly little girl, reckless little girl, chose someone else. Like now is not the time to give up. He will not let her make a choice, a bad choice, because obviously he thinks is bad. It will not be a choice. He will not allow her to make a reckless choice, which goes back to what I mentioned earlier, choice and lack of choice. The idea of not being able to refuse and playing around with that language is just so well done here. Yeah, I just noticed this as I was recording. Isn't it interesting that the first time that Annalise has made a choice, because all the other times she has no choice, like the first time she's made a choice is bad, right? He's like, this choice sucks. How could they do this, right? And he even says in the dialogue, like, making a decision without me? Who does the queen think she is? And so clearly he's like, everybody else is stupid. They couldn't make a good choice to save their life. And obviously this is self-serving, because obviously he would think that it's a bad choice. But I think that that's just so interesting. Like the first choice that Annalise was able to make, he's just like, well, that's the wrong one. That's the wrong one to save the kingdom. So in terms of the instrumental for this part, I really like how it's slow to return here, because unlike other parts of the song, he's planning on the spot. Like now he has to make whole new plans. It's more foreboding, it's more menacing than before. And something that's really important is familiarity, like making your audience snap into the song. And then when you earned that, when you earned their familiarity and you earned lulling the audience into that security, you pull it out from under them, you change something. And that's what makes things so satisfying, is that now we're defying expectations and we're also doing that for an emotional reason. And this has the same rhyme structure as the opening does. I like how they handled setback and get back. The general rule, if you want to call it that, like, it's not actually a rule, but this is like what we were taught, the preferred way of doing things. If you need to rhyme something like this where it has the same ending, like back with back, right? You want to have the word before it rhyme. So setback and get back is okay because the set and the get is the thing that is supposed to rhyme, not the back. Whereas if they just said setback and coming back, that would be a bad rhyme because you're just rhyming back with back. And so that was a nice little thing that they did here to make sure that things were more clean. I don't think that temporary and momentary are supposed to rhyme. It's more of something that has to do with flow because we have temporary, momentary, and then conveniently, right? So it's like harsher words, heavier words, and then a lighter word. And now we're getting into some Barbie movie discourse, if you want to call it that. It's not actually discourse, it's just that people disagree what the word is here. Some people think it's momentary lapse, as in a lapse of judgment, but the subtitles of the movie say momentary loss, as in we may have lost the battle, but we will win the war. Usually I'd be like, this is ridiculous. If the subtitles say it, people just heard lapse wrong, but I do hear lapse. And the thing is with the subtitles is that even for Has Been Hotel, some of the subtitles are wrong. Sometimes the person subtitling can mishear things. The only way to know for sure would be through the sheet music, and that's not accessible as far as I can find. So for a lot of song covers, you have people swearing up and down that it's lapse. And what makes it hard to tell is how Preminger's singer pronounces it, because he doesn't say lapse like that. He says lops, right? He has this O vowel instead of an A to sound more refined, and that's what gets people confused, I think. And so as a singer, I'll rule that you can say it as lapse if you want to, but you need to do the inflection that Preminger does, or else it doesn't really rhyme as well anymore. Like, you can't say lapse, you have to say lops. I talked about the difference between sure and sure, right? And so if you want to say lapse, you just have to make sure you say lops, and that would be okay. The O vowel is important there. But because people disagree, I do want to talk about both meanings. Obviously, I think that momentary loss is, self-explanatory. It's, oh, we're losing right now, but that's okay. My ego's not bruised. I'm gonna keep fighting. What would be interesting if it is momentary lapse, though, is it a lapse in his judgment? The queen's judgment? Like, I'm inclined, if this is the actual lyric, to think that he means the queen, but it could even be both. Like, how could he let the queen be alone for so long? She's going rogue, right? And he won't hold it against her. Like, yeah, she snubbed him right now, but out of the goodness of his heart, he will still save the day, even though the queen insulted him. Like, it was a momentary lapse in the queen's judgment to make a decision without him, can't hold it against her. But either way, he's saying that he can swallow his pride, go about his business. But yeah, if it's lapse, you really have to stretch lops in order for it to make sense. But if it's loss, then it is a perfect rhyme. In terms of more alliteration things, bruise, back, boss, bet, bullion, like those are really crisp. And I don't mind bruise, who's, and do's. Usually I do mind, like I say, if you're gonna do internal rhymes or just rhymes in this similar fashion, to do it in an even number. But I didn't even notice it. Like, I only noticed it in my final script revisions. It's more when there's two lines that are right next to each other. So for example, when we talked about respectless for Has Been Hotel, I believe the line is, you and the V's are inane and uninformed, smug wannabes who don't heed when you've been warned. So that's weird because it's like you got V's, you got heed, and then you got wannabes, right? So you have this weird little thing there where there's only three. So this isn't really a bother for me because they're so far apart from each other. It's only when the lines are stacked, and Wish also did this too in a little bit of a suspicious way. So I do not think that this is actually sus at all. I don't mind that there's three of them. It doesn't feel forced. It doesn't feel like the lyricist was like, oh yes, I'm going to stuff as many rhymes with bruise as possible here, which is usually the problem with the other thing I said, is that usually the unevenness is the lyricist wanting to be clever or flex or something like that, and it just makes it sound off, whereas this sounds fine. So this is a little bit different because it wasn't a rhyme, but in the intro before it had and how, but in this modification of the intro, we have this ego and no, which is kind of the same vibe, but not, again, instead of the H, this is more of an internal rhyme, and ego, show, and no, they don't all rhyme perfectly with each other, but there's a nice sound between them. There was something similar with how and had, like that was the alliteration, not the rhyme, but there was something like that in the original intro, and of course this is a modification, so it is now allowed to be different, as we said, but we also had pay and today, and so they're still trying to maintain some of what they had in a similar spot. If it was just ego and show, I'd be like, I don't know about that, but because it's the three of them, I actually think that it flows a little bit nicer. And of course, for another reference to wealth and money, this is money betting your gold. What I also like about this modification is that we can take it as Preminger being a little bit more unhinged. We have three clean rhymes here, right? Like scraping, escaping, rug, dug, and then do's and refuse. But then we come back here and things are a little bit more complicated, right? And again, they earn the right to change something. We still have the ending rhymes in the same place, but there's more of these little moments throughout where there's something to help with the flow here. He wants to punctuate his points, so he's getting a bit more fancy and unhinged, and it doesn't have the same neatness as it does. Like, again, the show, ego, and no, and that sort of thing, like those little changes, it serves to show us that Preminger, he's thinking on the spot, and because he's thinking on the spot, he needs to sound more convincing. Instrumentally, the music builds really nicely here. The violins are starting to sound super stressed, and they get a little bit more stressful later, but you'll hear what I mean. It's starting to spiral out of control. Now, in my Wish video, I did complain about sentences starting with but and that sort of thing, filler words, right? However, this is different because he's thinking about ideas on the spot. He's striking a new plan. I think that some people have been taking the wrong meaning from some of my videos. It's not like you can never ever in your entire life start a lyric with and. It's all contextual, right? That's lazy when it's all that you do, but if you're using it in order to make a point, that's when it becomes okay. Like some people have asked, why is this okay here, but not okay here? And like 99% of the time, the reason I'll probably tell you is because in terms of the context, it seems like it's the lyricist being lazy instead of the lyricist making a choice. If the entire song was like this, I would think that this was a little sus. But it's like how someone may say, yes, I know, I'll do this, and then after that, I'll do that, and then I just got hit with another brilliant idea, so they're building off of each other. Instead, I don't know how to do my lyricism, so every sentence starts with and that, and that's it. Au revoir and moi was just so clever. Like, I just can't believe they did that. And it also works for characterization because Preminger wants to sound more clever and more intelligent and more composed in this moment of weakness. Like, the French has not appeared this entire time, right? But the French is coming out because now he wants to sound smarter. And it may also be because the king is foreign, right? And so, like, he literally will say au revoir because that's what they say over there. Could also be that. And I love the word suppose because he doesn't say, I'll make the girl go missing, right? Because he could have, but he doesn't say that. He says, suppose, as if I have nothing to do with it. And that's so clever. Again, one simple word choice changes everything. And make the news is so unhinged because it has another double meaning, like making the news as in making the papers, the stories, he's the hero, but he is literally making the news, guys. By kidnapping her, he is making the news. So it's not just making the news as in being in the news or being the news. It is creating the news. He is creating the problem that he is gonna solve, and that's so smart. Also, this is the first time that Preminger mentions the queen is just gonna hand Annalise over to him like a prize that he won because he rescued her. Like, now he really doesn't care. Like, before he implies that she has this secret love for him that has been happening this entire time, right? That I guess he just like couldn't ask about or couldn't talk about because he had no reason. He had no valid reason to. The gold gives him a reason to ask Annalise to marry him because it puts them on the same social standing. Now he doesn't give a fuck, right? He's just like, the queen will just hand her over like an object. And humble is a great change because even though this was implied before, this false humbleness comes back up again, this false politeness, like, how can I refuse? We have some nice alliteration. Bring her back is really nice. Suppose, so, says, all of those little things that we've talked about before. And in this phrase, we can hear that the instrumental is getting really stressed here. There's a flute or maybe a violin string. I do have problems discerning the instruments sometimes, especially when they're so high of pitch. I can't tell which one it is. It could even be both, but they're so stressed that you can hear how high they're going. And now we can see that this verse is returning to the neater form that the other verses had. So we have throne, alone, shoes, refuse. We also have a little cheeky fit and nitwit in here. So even though it's in a different spot, we also have, instead of coat and moat, we have a nitwit and fit. So again, it's taking what we know, it's changing it in what I think is an acceptable amount, right? Again, we're breaking the familiarity, but still in a place that's familiar. And so we have these new internal rhymes to go with the old rhymes that we know already are coming. And then we also have arise and Annalise, kingdom, castle, kiss. And this is the first time we hear about Preminger taking the throne from Annalise. Like, it's personal now. He never says that before. He says, if you give it to me, I guess I'll take it. But this is actually like taking as in ripping it from her. And I think now it's because it's personal. The queen made a decision without him. Annalise chose Dominic over him. He's not just going to accept the scraps that he is given by the queen. He's just not going to accept the offer of the crown. If she happens to offer it, he is gonna take what's his. And yeah, he straight up calls Annalise stupid here, which is important for our context of the movie because we know how intelligent Annalise is. We know from the classes she's taking, her love of science, how in the end she saves the kingdom. And so for the entire story of the movie, it's important that we note that Preminger thinks that Annalise is stupid when she's not. Kiss my shoes is interesting because there's kind of the lick my boots thing as a phrase, like sucking up to someone in authority, that Annalise will suck up to Preminger, but there's also shoe kissing as in like groveling. And what I think is interesting is that this is the first time mine is used this entire time. And now we have the full extent of Preminger's possessiveness. He acts before like things will happen by happenstance, that his plans are all just coincidence or fate, but now we have him possessing something intentionally and wanting to take something to be his. And you guys may say, well, Cal, he says, if the crown should fit, so isn't that him still being falsely humble? And you're right. However, this time it's contrasted with him not being, like, the mask fell off for a second, right? He says, will be mine and mine alone. That's when the mask fell off. Now he's putting the mask back on. So as opposed to before when the mask was always on, now we have really nice contrast in this slightly adjusted verse. And I feel like the crown should fit is also interesting because you have, like, if the shoe fits, which is, you know, sometimes a bad thing that people say, but it's if the slipper fits, as in like rags to riches Cinderella as well. It's not just about wearing the crown, it's that the crown only fits if the ruler is actually better, if the ruler is fitting. Like when Cinderella puts on the slipper, it's because it's hers that it fits perfectly. When we say something mean to someone and we're like, well, if the shoe fits, that's like if the shoe fits them. Like if we call someone an asshole, it's like, oh, well, if the shoe fits, if it only fits because you're actually an asshole, right? So that's kind of the same idea here. The crown is only fitting because Preminger is objectively better. And the outro to the song is just so amazing because instrumentally, the ending of the song is like this big show-stopping like kick line number. Even in the visuals, they're literally doing a kick line. I think Preminger also does some sort of like box step or something in here. It's really funny. Like they actually had them dance, but now we can hear in terms of the instrumental, because I do dance, but I'm not a professional dancer. I'm a singer who can dance, right? So we won't talk about that too much other than like iconic. Like it's great that they had them actually dancing as if they're in a show. But in terms of the instrumentals, we have the menacing instruments with the more royal ones this time. And so we hear how this is a villain's big, powerful conclusion because we're taking all the elements that we heard before and we're like cranking them up to 100. The entire orchestra is back. We have these violins sounding very harsh to give it that villainy. I talked about the instruments before, everything sort of came and went, right? Like, we had this mechanical sound, sometimes there's trumpets for the reaction, sometimes there's not. But now, everything is back. When it comes to structure, again, this is sharing the same rhyme scheme and structure as the intro, and then also as the modified intro. Ready with the roses sounds really nice, and then stand by with the champagne, nice alliteration again. Ready, roses, stand, and sham. Like, stand and sham are a little bit different, but it has the spirit, right? And so we have some nice alliteration. And then and stand also have, again, this is not a rhyme, but just a nice thing for the flow. And for this line, again, we have this idea that it's Preminger's brilliant plan that will make it so he does not lose. Like, before he says it's a momentary loss, but he will never lose again after this. Or you could say the only reason why he suffered a momentary loss, right? Because this is sort of the second time that we have lose come up in this way. The only reason why that happened is because Dominic took him by surprise. But when you have a brilliant plan, you never lose. The only reason why they got one up over on him is because he literally didn't know. But when Preminger actually knows he's going into battle, he never loses because his plans are so brilliant. Champagne and Charlemagne are completely unhinged. Like, I just love who wrote this. They did such a crazy thing here because it's not just the fact that they rhyme, and they rhyme really well. Like, they have the same, again, sort of beginning, and then they have the same middle. So, like, that's good. But also, okay, so a history lesson, I guess, from Wikipedia, because I'm not a history major, but I looked it up. Charlemagne is a ruler who was the emperor of Rome, and it says that he facilitated an intellectual and cultural renaissance. And maybe I'm reading too much into this, but that's what we're here to do. Because there's such an emphasis on literacy and just intelligence in this movie, and then also, like, what I'm reading about this ruler, right? Like, an intellectual and cultural renaissance. It's interesting because Preminger wants to be as popular as Charlemagne, but he doesn't actually value any of those things in the entire movie. Like, he's like, go back to your books, schoolboy. Like, you know, and he calls Annalise stupid, even though she's not. And so I wonder if the point that they're trying to make, like, more than a clever rhyme, it's supposed to show how surface level and shallow that Preminger is, because he doesn't actually understand why Charlemagne was so popular. It wasn't just because, you know, he was rich or something. It was because of this intellectual and cultural renaissance, and those are things that Preminger does not care about. According to the internet, Charlemagne still had this imposing physical presence, like strength in combat, but these pages that I was reading were highlighting the fact that he's an intellectual, and Preminger is like anti-intellectual through this entire movie. Like, he has street smarts, right? Yes, Preminger is cunning, but he doesn't value book smarts or being well-read, you could say. All of his smarts, like manipulating people, you could say that those are street smarts. So I find that that's such a little clever detail that, like, no child would notice that. That's for us, guys. That's for the adults to be like, yo, that's so cool that they did that. And it's even more funny because Preminger does not, like, go back to your books, schoolboy, right? But he says before this chapter closes, right? And so it's different when it's his fairy tale. He thinks of himself as the hero, as a character in a fairy tale, and that's what the chapter closing kind of means in this context, right? It's like, oh, well, books are okay if I'm the protagonist, otherwise books are stupid. And so I think that that's just an awesome little detail that, again, you know, if the crown fits, if the slipper fits, the chapter, like, this idea that he thinks that he is the hero in his own story, the story that he has been writing this entire time. Thankless job is so funny because, of course, it would be thankless. He's actively sabotaging them, but it also has a double meaning. No one is ever going to thank him, but he can't refuse the idea of sabotaging Annalise and Dominic given how much he sacrificed. And then it's the idea of his arrogance, like, he's doing them a favor. So, like, first of all, it's like, yeah, like, literally no one's gonna thank you because you're doing eval, right? You're doing a bad thing. But you could think that he actually thinks this. Like, it's the idea of his arrogance that he knows that kidnapping Annalise isn't gonna win anybody over, right? But he has to do it anyway. It's the right thing to do. I need to clean up the mess that the queen has made because she has made a mistake. Even if I didn't want to marry Annalise, marrying Dominic is a mistake. She should have never made a decision without me. And so from his POV, it's like, oh, you know, correcting the queen's mistakes. So it's such a thankless job. And so I love the double meaning in here. And that's where the song ends. It's pretty short, but it gets the point across really well. And you'll notice it hits a lot of of the same beats as the Disney songs do. I didn't actually know this until my mom pointed it out, but the beginning, if you listen to the beginning of this song and listen to Poor Unfortunate Souls, you have like the person slowly explaining their backstory. When it does the silencio, I won't let go, that's like, if you want to cross the bridge, my sweet, you've got to pay the toll. Like, that's a little fast part, right? And so it has a lot of the same beats as a Disney song without actually being a Disney song and being able to exist as its own thing. And maybe musically, it's not as complex as something like Hellfire, but like, this was for a direct to DVD Barbie movie, guys. We have talked for, I don't know how long this video will be. I have 2 hours of footage. We have talked for an hour about this song because it's just so iconic and like filled to the brim with all these little musical and lyrical things, right? It executes its objective perfectly, and even though it's not as complicated, if you want to call it that, even though it's not as complicated as the other Disney songs, like, it still has a lot to analyze in its own right. It has just as much depth as any other Disney song does. I hope that you guys enjoyed my analysis of Preminger's song. This has been Calxiyn caring way too much. Let me know what you guys want to see me cover next, and I will see you next time. Bye!